And now the Ethics Center is proud to present Artificial Intelligence and the Complexities of Love and Creativity in Ishiguro's Clara in the Sun. How many people have read the book? Oh, okay, good, excellent, it's going to be great. So our speaker is Jill Larson, who many of you know, professor in the Department of English. She's taught at Western since 1992. Dr. Larson earned her graduate degrees at Indiana University, Bloomington, alma mater, where she specialized in 19th century British literature and culture. Her book-length study of late Victorian British narratives and ethical theory was published by Cambridge University Press. Continuing to pursue her interest in ethics and literature, she serves on the board of Western's Ethics Center, so that's how I've gotten to know Jill. And she's developed literature courses on topics such as ethics and belief and ethics, science, and the future. Her current research actually does focus exactly on this, memory and ethics in the fiction of Ishiguro. So we will have time after the presentation to ask questions, so don't go away. And now I'm going to turn it to Jill. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thanks everyone for coming during this time of the semester, which is always like very busy, and I really appreciate your attendance and welcome. I'm especially pleased to be here talking about literature because I think the Ethics Center Speaker Series, which is so vibrant and wonderful, also needs some fiction in the mix. I believe that there's a lot that narrative ethics can offer us. And I hope that through this work in progress on Ishiguro, you get some sense of what it means to kind of do moral philosophy along with literature, to really think through some of the issues that confront us, and do it in a way that unfolds with particularity and lots of, just a different form of ethical deliberation. I know some of you have read the novel that I'm focusing on, Clara in the Sun. Some of you have not. If you've read fiction by Ishiguro other than this novel, I think that my paper, even though the artificial intelligence component is new in this novel, his subtle treatment of memory, of identity, of relationships, all of that will be in common with any of the Ishiguro novels you've read. And in fact, that particularly interests me, like what Clara does that connects with what he does in his other novels. But because some of you haven't read it, I'm going to do this really quick summary of the novel. It takes place in the US, sometime in the near future. The city isn't specified. The characters live in the country, travel into the city. Its narrator is a robot named Clara. She's solar powered. As a result, she's a worshiper of the sun. The other character in the title. She's called an artificial friend, or an AF. So when I use the term AF, that refers to artificial friend. We meet her in a store before she's purchased. And she's purchased for a girl, Josie, whose mother, Chrissy, is struggling with her decision to offer gene editing for enhanced intelligence to her daughter. This is her second daughter. She's decided to do that even though her first daughter died of side effects that accompany this procedure. Nonetheless, she has gone ahead and done that for Josie. So that's where we are kind of at the beginning of the novel. Now, Josie is also experiencing illness. She's a young teenager. She's planning to spend her life with the boy next door, Rick, who is not lifted, not gene edited. His mother decided to decline to subject him to that. So that's the setup. Helen and Rick are British, which is kind of interesting too. An important character in the second half of the novel is Mr. Capaldi. He's a bit of a villain. He's the mad computer scientist. He's also the architect of a plan to continue Josie, continue her, meaning should she die, she would be continued in life through artificial intelligence, and Clara would play a role in that potentially. So he and Chrissy, Josie's mother, want Clara to use her skill as an observant robot to be Josie, right? I don't think there are any real spoilers in that, so leave it at that. I'll also mention that in addition to my paper, I have notes and thoughts on aspects of technology in the novel. So in the Q&A, if you want to kind of go in that direction, that's fine too. I talk about AI in my paper, but I kind of take it into a lot of like kind of ethical issues that are broadly like human and existential. But I want to summarize some of the issues related to technology in the novel that we could say a lot more about beyond what my paper covers. Loneliness and replacement of the human, artificial friendship, gene editing, continuing a loved one after death via AI, technology and privacy, technology and obsolescence. And to varying degrees, the novel is really interested in all of those ways of thinking about the future. And it's amazing, this was published in 2001, to think about how AI has taken off, even from the first time I read the novel. So there's definitely a lot to talk about. Even though we put AI in the title to get you here, my actual title is Confabulation and the Complexities of Love and Creativity in Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun. In recent years, more sophisticated artificial intelligence and the breakthrough of large language models such as ChatGPT have prompted us to think about what these advances in technology might mean for our future. As we began to emerge from the pandemic in 2021, Ishiguro's novel Clara and the Sun was published early that year. I had just taught a course the preceding fall semester on Ishiguro's novels, teaching for the first time fully online instead of in person. With its references to remote learning, isolation, and artificial friends, Clara was one of several novels published in those post-pandemic years to prompt discussion of technology and the shadows it is casting on our vision of the future. Despite all its promise, artificial intelligence is something many of us are greeting warily. Geoffrey Hinton, the computer scientist dubbed the godfather of AI and a recent winner of a Nobel Prize for his work in machine learning, he resigned from Google in 2023 because, he said, he wanted to be in a position to alert society to the risks of AI. Ishiguro's novel taps into these qualms about the future while also continuing a preoccupation of his other novels, The Unreliable Narrator and the Role of Memory in Stories We Tell Ourselves About Our Lives. Listening to a recent interview with Geoffrey Hinton, I perked up when he said that it's misleading to use the word hallucinate for what happens when AI makes puzzling errors. He prefers the word confabulation or confabulate. He made it clear that this is how human memory works too. So it shouldn't seem alien to us. As a word person and a reader of Ishiguro's novels, I felt like I'd stumbled upon the perfect descriptor for the phenomenon of memory in which we feel certain something is true when in reality it isn't. The most dramatic form of confabulation occurs for people who have suffered brain damage or experiencing dementia. But as Hinton points out, we all have times when we think we're remembering something correctly, but distortions have crept in. Confabulation is a paradox, honest lying. Another definition of the word that we may all be more familiar with is conversation. A confab is an informal, private conversation of the sort characters in novels have all the time. We think of these conversations as words we share with each other, language that contributes to our experience of the complexities of human relationships, the challenges of communication, and the creation and deepening of love and all that mitigates against loneliness. Keeping both meanings of confabulation in mind, I'd like to explore how Clara and the Sun helps us think about what it means to be human in at least three important ways. The first involves narrative and identity, how we tell our stories to ourselves. The second involves love, how our words, stories, and conversations foster complex relationship. The third involves Ishiguro's subtle metafictional meanings that we are driven to make and how we are driven to make and learn from art and creative representations of ourselves. As an artificial friend, Clara is doubly such a creative representation. She has been manufactured within the world of the novel, but of course she was also created by the novelist. Clara and the Sun employs a technique in fiction and in literature that literary theorists have termed defamiliarization. Many of you here are probably really familiar with that concept. Because our narrator is a robot programmed to have human qualities and to learn about humans, we see our familiar selves through her eyes in a distant, unfamiliar way. One tendency this defamiliarization helps us perceive in a fresh way is our need to order our memories, which is what Clara, from the storage yard at the end of the novel, tells us she does. It's what narrators in Ishiguro's novels nearly always do. Etsuko, in A Pale View of Hills, pieces together her life with her younger daughter in Japan after her older daughter dies of suicide, seeking to understand who she was as a mother. And Stevens, the butler in The Remains of the Day, recounts his memories when he's coming to terms with just who his employer was, a Nazi sympathizer, what this means for his own identity in all his years of service. In Clara and the Sun, we're able to see through the narration of a robot how the human mind also experiences the very confabulation Clara herself has become aware of. This is a quotation. Over the last few days, she tells us, quote, some of my memories have started to overlap in curious ways. She understands that the conflation of memories is not a result of disorientation, and that the memories can be distinguished and reordered if she wishes to do so. That suggests to us a conscious play with memory that Clara engages in from this place in the yard where the story she tells in the novel, originates. She says, another quotation, even when such composite memories come into my mind, I remain conscious of their rough borders, such as might have been created by an impatient child tearing with her fingers instead of cutting with scissors. Clara tells us that the vividness of the composite memories transports her from the reality of the yard and the hard ground she sits on. With her image of the impatient creative child, we might see Clara here at the end putting aside the patience and precision of reason that dominate for her during her active service as an artificial friend to Josie, for the freedom to revel in her memories and tell her story, if only to herself. Of course, the story is for us as well as for Clara, but only when we get to the end do we fully recognize how unreliable she is as a narrator, how important it is for her to think of herself as an AF who has given, quote, good service and prevented Josie from becoming lonely, as she explains to the manager when the manager visits the yard. We also know by this point that Clara has begun what is called a slow fade, and that some of her PEG9 fluid was removed by Paul, Josie's father, in a similar yard during the family's visit to the city, compromising her cognitive ability, if only slightly. By highlighting the ways Clara has been altered by age, by experience, and damage, Ishiguro shows us ourselves as we order our past, occasionally conflating memories or sliding into confabulation, motivated as we so often are to create an identity that makes sense to us and allows us to feel good about who we are. This process is deeply human, and what's fascinating about it is its sincerity, keeping in mind that the lying involved in this process is also paradoxically honest. When Clara first arrives at the yard, she is struck by the untidy identity, again, a quotation from the novel, untidy identity of the objects surrounding her because they are dented or have severed or protruding cables. That impression of a messy, imperfect, rough identity is part of our human reality, but so is the impulse to make it tidy. The imagery of the construction crane on the horizon in the yard reminds us not only that Clara is a construction, but that, like us, she constructs her story. When we think back over the novel with a focus on meaning making, identity construction, accurate memory, and confabulation in mind, Ishiguro gives us a lot to sort through. To offer examples of what I interpret as moments of Clara confabulating, I'll call our attention to small moments that remind us that our narrator is offering dialogue she remembers, but in words that carry her own perspective. Knowing what human beings are like, we as readers also come to know what Clara is like. And this combined knowledge helps us imagine what likely happened in contrast to what she reports. For example, early in the novel, Clara says that when Josie comes to the store, she talks with her about how the big building must block the AF's view of where the sun goes down. Clara quotes Josie as saying, "Where we live, there's nothing in the way. From up in my room, you can see exactly where the sun goes down, the exact place he goes to at night." Is it likely that Josie refers to the sun as he? Is it even likely that she notices the sun being blocked by the building? Is this what a young teenager is thinking about? No. But keeping in mind the sunsets that she and Josie are likely to enjoy later, this seems like Clara's representation of other kind words uttered by Josie, who is perhaps also commented on the great view from the bedroom, knowing that it would be a selling point for Clara. We may suspect that facts are wrong without doubting that Clara was struck by Josie's kindness and consideration. There are other moments like this in Clara's remembering of conversations with Josie, and in small points, as when Clara reports Helen referring to Vance as capital F, capital L, former lover, Clara's own designation for him. This is very human. We've all been accused of putting words in someone else's mouth when we paraphrase another person with too much of our own inflection. It's fascinating, though, to see how Ishiguro subtly conveys the recognizable quality of Clara's identity while also creating an AF and narrator who is remarkably self-effacing and other-directed, more so than really any human being is likely to be. An example of confabulation that is less minor and subtle and more likely to provoke skepticism from readers is a human being's willingness to entertain the possibility that Josie will get well again if Clara goes to Mr. McBain's barn just as the sun is setting, or if she's able to damage the pollution-causing, sun-angering Cootings machine. We recognize that when a loved one is dangerously ill, we as humans grasp at straws and or tap into superstition or faith in God. Ishiguro defamiliarizes these qualities by embodying them in Rick and in Josie's father, Paul, in their willingness to aid Clara in absurd activities, as if these activities were completely normal. In my interpretation of the novel, though, these are moments of confabulation for Clara. Rather than happening in just the way she narrates these scenes, we are led to suspect that something else happened. It's more likely that Rick doesn't have a conversation with the AF about Clara's plan, but simply offers her assistance in crossing the field out of kindness when he sees her struggling. As for Paul, though, the suggestion, it seems to me, is much darker. He wants his daughter Josie to get well, but he does not want Clara to take part in the plan his ex-wife, Chrissy, and Mr. Capaldi have concocted to continue or replicate Josie with the help of her AF. As such, it is likely that Paul drains the PEG-9 fluid from Clara's head in an attempt to sabotage the plan, not to support her own mysterious, benevolent scheme to please the sun and restore Josie's health. The novel provides evidence for this when Clara tells us that she is suspicious of Paul and even says to him, "Is it possible Mr. Paul has suggested this course not only to destroy the Cootings machine, but also to damage Clara and Mr. Capaldi's plan?" So Clara herself presents that as a possibility. In order to recognize confabulation, we need to see slippages of this sort. Clara tells us about the two of them in a joint endeavor motivated by hope. But this narrative is undercut what was likely a more menacing reality, one that traumatizes Clara. Unlike the rest of the novel's narration, this story of the fluid being removed isn't told chronologically, but emerges in fragmented bursts of memory that interrupt the narration of that day's events, mimicking the return of repressed memory after trauma. We need to keep in mind that Clara has also just been let in on the plan for her own extinction. Her loss of identity in the identity of the child she's caring for. Chrissy has just implored her to continue Josie for me, and Ishiguro gives us subtle indications that the prospect of this is disturbing for Clara. In short, at the end of the novel, as Clara presents the story of her service to Josie, creating an identity for herself, she confabulates, making her story distinct from the story of suffering we know her fellow AF Rosa endured. Clara makes her own story much more positive, and in fact more positive than it likely was in reality. Even in Clara's distorted account, Josie's kindness becomes indifference punctuated by kind gestures. When they first meet, Josie promises Clara that she will not be stored in a closet. But as we know, in the end, Clara is indeed moved to a storage closet in the home, where Josie arranges a platform for Clara to stand on to see out the window. They have come a long way from the shared bedroom where they watch the sunset. Besides these features of the novel that help us understand Clara's creation of identity, and by extension our own confabulating and ordering of memories, we ponder through Clara the complexities of human love. The novel focuses on troubled relationships that are complicated, fractured, and imperfect, and shows them to us primarily through the human words and conversations that Clara observes and attempts to make sense of in her effort to mitigate Josie's loneliness. The words are accompanied by facial expressions and body language, and Clara is alert to all of these forms of human communication. The parent-child relationships of Josie and her mother, and later her father, and Rick and his mother, are fraught with emotion. We see Josie's struggles with a mother who is plagued by guilt and an obsessive desire for control after endangering the health of both her daughters by choosing to lift or subject them to the process of genetic enhancement. We see Rick's anxiety and sense of responsibility for Helen, given her emotional instability, and her own guilt about not choosing gene editing for her son, which would have given him more chances in life. Later, we observe through Clara Josie's complicated, nervous happiness when reunited with the father she rarely sees. We see young love that is already layered with memories of shared experience for Josie and Rick, but also tense, unhappy scenes between Chrissy and Paul and Helen and Vance, couples who used to be in love but now are miserable in each other's company. Clara is understandably bewildered by this form of learning, and when Paul tells her she would have to learn Josie's heart if she were to successfully replace her after death, Clara believes that might be possible but would undoubtedly be challenging. It might be like a house with many rooms, she says to him. The language echoes the Bible, of course. Jesus says in John 14:2, "My Father's house has many rooms." This evocation of infinite divine love is fitting, given both Clara's sense that the human heart, though complex, must be limited, quote, and her faith in the transcendent power of the Son. But Paul asks her to imagine the infinite inside the human. He says, but then suppose you stepped into one of those rooms and discovered another room within it. And inside that room, another room still. Rooms within rooms within rooms. Isn't that how it might be, trying to learn Josie's heart? We think of artificial intelligence possessing capacity for nearly infinite learning, far beyond our own rate of learning and capability. But we also think of something ineffable and inexplicably complex in our human nature. At least some of us do. The novel puts in dialogue, on the one hand, those like Capaldi and possibly Paul himself, who believe that there is nothing unique within us, nothing that machine learning is unable to duplicate, and on the other hand, those of us who cannot let go of the old-fashioned sense that we're animated by a soul, a spirit, a heart that eludes reason and limits. At the end of the novel, Clara resolves the problem for herself. Quote, Mr. Capaldi believed there was nothing special inside Josie that couldn't be continued. He told the mother he'd searched and found nothing like that. There was something very special, but it wasn't inside Josie. It was inside those who loved her. Even as Ishiguro explores in his novels the complex ways we form our identities through remembering, forgetting, misremembering, and ordering our memories into stories, he also directs us to another layer of the self that is formed in the world by people who have loved us, all perhaps understanding us a bit differently, as surely Chrissy, Paul, and Rick all understand and love Josie differently, possessing distinct, particularized, and likely partially confabulated memories of her. The mind-boggling complexity of one person's identity as formed through and in relationships that are themselves contradictory and complicated leads Clara to conclude that she would not have succeeded in replicating Josie if she had died instead of recovering, sorry, that is a spoiler, as she does from her illness. After exploring first Ishiguro's representation of the human process of creating identity through a complex and imperfect memory, and second, of experiencing human love and relationships and all their messy contradictions and complications as another way of thinking about making us who we are, I'd like to move to my third category of what it means to be human, how we learn about who we are from art, from looking at visual art, from watching actors in movies, from reading novels. Again and again in his fiction, Ishiguro creates characters who follow an impulse to make art. His second novel, An Artist of the Floating World, features a protagonist who is a painter. Ishiguro's long, strange, funny novel called The Unconsoled is about pianists. Tommy, in Ishiguro's Never Let Me Go, does amazing, intricate little drawings. The relationship between life and the representation of life in art, then, is a preoccupation for Ishiguro, as is the interplay between the real and the fabricated. This theme of how we learn about who we are from art and artificial versions of the human is both evident and subtle in Clara and the Sun. The plan that Capaldi convinces Chrissy to have faith in, the replication of Josie through her AF Clara, is initially referred to as a portrait. An artist of sorts, as well as a mad computer scientist, Capaldi seeks to extend the realism of the painter or the photographer or novelist. He seeks to obliterate the distinction between real person and not real person. Through this motif of simulated human, Ishiguro also invites us to think about literary characters. and how they become artificial friends. As early as In a Pale View of Hills is Ishiguro's first novel, published in 1982, Ishiguro's fiction has explored how we project our own stories onto remembered or imagined others as a way of attempting to understand who we are. One might say this process happens without fiction, and it does. The experience of a remembered friend can help us process our own experience, as it does for Ishiguro Satsuko in his first novel. But this processing doesn't happen without the creative human impulse to fictionalize, either in the honest lying of confabulation or in the way we seek to find comfort or to gain understanding through the artificial friends or portraits of humans that we find both in our memory and in fictional characters. In order to bring characters to life, a novelist has to be them, in a sense. Before this can happen, the novelist's work, like the work of the AF, is observing closely and learning about people. The complexity of that multi-roomed heart, as well as the more easily observed mannerisms and quirks. When Clara is at Morgan Falls, Chrissy asks her to be the daughter whose illness has prevented her from joining them in the outing, to be Josie. This is the creation of character, the work of the writer or the actor. It's interesting to note that as accomplished at mimicry as Clara is, her own ideas and objections to assuming the identity of another slip in. In this sense, she seems more human than AI, because of course a novelist slips in through the creation of character, and great actors both lose themselves in a role and bring themselves to it. "Who's this talking?" Chrissy asks when Clara slips out of Josie to say, "There's special help coming, something no one thought of yet." Similarly, after the visit to Capaldi's studio, when Chrissy explains the plan to have Clara merge into the shell of Josie and implores her to continue Josie for me, Clara says, raising her arms in the air, "Then what would happen to all this?" We're taken aback by Chrissy's response. "What does it matter? That's just fabric." In the novel, Clara is fabric, and for us, Clara is words on the page. But the human ingenuity and creativity present in technology and in art make her much more than that. And Ishiguro shows us that Clara is also much more than that to herself, even as we recognize that she's not exactly human, just as all fictional characters we come to care about are not exactly human, but a reflection of the human. The mirror of art can reverse and distort the human while reflecting it, and the novel subtly reminds us of that when Josie's father gives her the gift of a small mirror that won't reverse her image. This is a very small detail in the novel, but he gives her this present of a mirror that won't reverse her image, that will faithfully reflect her, just as Clara is supposed to do in the event of Josie's death. As we know, Josie is ill because of her mother's decision to lift her, and in the midst of another episode in the novel that calls our attention to art making, Josie and Rick quarrel about the choices of their mothers. Helen's decision not to subject Rick to gene editing is something Josie deplores because of the implications it has for her and Rick and their future together. And this emerges in their conversation while they are playing what is called the bubble game. Given the focus on technology in the novel, with this game, Ishiguro was riffing on the texting young people engage in, sending bubble after bubble to each other to build relationships. But on a literal level, in the novel, Josie is drawing and Rick is writing, filling in speech or thought bubbles for the people she draws. And together they create collaborative art. The drawing from the bubble game that emerges from their quarrel is Josie's representational art that makes us think, on a rereading of the novel anyway, of the portrait or the representational art of Capaldi. For those of you who've read the novel, you might remember the 3D version of Josie is suspended from the ceiling. When Clara sees it, she notices that Josie looks disappointed and afraid. In other words, the Capaldi Josie. In Josie's own drawing, as Clara describes it, Josie and Rick are both floating in the sky. Behind them in the sky are 7 birds flying in formation, which pretty clearly represents Rick's drones in the novel, his own creative work. And his creative work is with technology. It's up to us to decide what is meant by the much larger bird that picture Josie, as Clara calls her, is happily offering picture Rick. Rick himself, angry that Josie has accused his mother of lacking courage, writes in such a way as to suggest not that this large bird is their plan, their chance to be together in the future despite social class differences and an advanced medical procedure that divides them, but Josie's own denial about her mother's decision and what it has meant for her, for Rick, and for Chrissy herself, the mother who feels very guilty all the time. This is the large bird she is offering him, a dream or impossible plan, this denial of hers. He writes dialogue for Picture Josie to speak. I wish I could go out and walk and run and skateboard and swim in lakes, but I can't because my mother has, capital C, courage. So instead, I get to stay in bed and be sick. I'm glad about this, I really am. Here, self-protective illusions and ways of constructing and framing circumstances and identity are captured in the art of the young people, just as they are in the art of the novel itself. The metafictional dimension of Clara and the Sun then comes to the foreground in the figure of the artificial friend and Capaldi's portrait, but it is also intimated in the collaborative art of Josie and Rick, and in Clara's efforts to bring the world into focus. Throughout the novel, her perception, unlike literal human perception, occasionally disintegrates into boxes that distort reality and the depth perception that we take for granted. It's a very fascinating aspect of the novel. For those of you who haven't read it, it's hard to describe, but her vision just separates everything into boxes when she has new experiences or is trying to navigate something disorienting. Here, Ishiguro shows us the art of realism devolving into basic components, just as a finished representational drawing of a bird might be traced back in a sketchbook to overlapping ovals. After Clara loses some of her PEG9 fluid, she meets someone new. Quote, when I turned toward the voice, I saw two funnels, one inserted into the other, the upper one tilting slightly forward towards me. Real people have become basic shapes. Clara suspects, quote, that many of these shapes weren't even three-dimensional, but had been sketched onto flat surfaces using clever shading techniques to give the illusion of roundness and depth. In this way, Ishiguro defamiliarizes our taken-for-granted perception of faces and human reality. Throughout Clara and the Sun, Ishiguro invites us to think about illusion, the illusion that we know through memory, what our experiences have been, the illusion of knowing another person despite the rooms within rooms of that person's heart. And finally, what I suggest is the most helpful life-enhancing illusion of all, that provided for us by art. Not only is it deeply human to be creative and recreate our experiences in all sorts of ways, it is also human to look into mirrors, literal and figurative, as a way to understand ourselves. With the advent of large language models and other rapid advances in artificial intelligence, we are wrestling to understand what this technology will mean for us. Ishiguro's Clara and the Sun doesn't provide us with any easy answers to our questions about AI or any simple solution to the problem of loneliness. Instead, it does the work of the best art. It encourages us to be honest about who we are and inspires us to think hard about who we want to be. Thanks.
We do have time for questions. So,
Questions?
how are we doing on hearing? I know I got loud next door. Can you use some mice? How are we doing?
Can everybody hear? Okay.
How philosophically is the hard problem of consciousness addressed?
Other people can chime in on this. I think the fact that he has Clara narrate the novel is a way of addressing the question of consciousness. Because it's like, I personally find it kind of impossible to think of her as not having consciousness because we're in. Yeah, self-consciousness too. Yeah, consciousness, self-conscious, but I don't know. Do other people see it differently?
But they don't talk about how that happened.
Yeah, that's that's the big one.
No.
I mean,
No.
Is there an implicit theory of consciousness, in the novel?
Well, again, let's have a discussion here. What do people think? I think when she's doing what she's programmed to do, which in part involves learning and observation, because she is like set apart from other robots, at least in her own account of herself, for being unusual and being unusually observant of details and very attentive to the world around her. And through that attention, she learns and is able to do things, right? So I don't know if you call that consciousness.
Is that part of the lexicon for agency and assuming the cogito, you know?
My own interpretation, I would say yes. I mean, I think ultimately she's meant to seem very human, and readers are and just living with AI confronts us with this impossible. I think this kind of addressed your question. This impossible position, like we know it's coding, we know it's not human, right? But then it has a voice. It talks
to us, but we know it's not human, right? And if we treat it as not human, we do a certain amount of like ethical, psychological damage to ourselves because we're practicing dehumanizing every time we engage, right? And that's like very unpleasant. And the novel does explore that. It explores the AF as defended by some, like vilified by others, you know, as any kind of difference would be. So that's one thing. But then on the other hand, we're not encouraged. I'm talking now kind of about real life. In real life, too, we're not encouraged to be psychotic about AI, right? To really like take it as human. So we're put in this place where we have to kind of pretend it's human, but also acknowledge it's not human, which reminds me very much of the way you might like write about a literary character or bond with or learn from a performance in a movie or something like that, right? So you know it's not real and you don't go so far as to be deluded about that. But at the same time, it seems very real.
The ethical dimension of the novel obviously centers on the issue of her agency.
No, not really. I think the main thing about the novel in my reading of it, Margaret Atwood said that Ishiguro's novels are never about what they pretend to be about. So I guess I just need to say I don't really think it's about AI. I mean, AI is in there and we can think about technology, we can think about the future, but I think it is this defamiliarizing of the human that he's most interested in. Like, who are we as humans and how can we understand that better by having an artificial human in our midst? See what I mean? I don't think he's like a social scientists like engaging in those kinds of questions in my reading. But again, it's a very tough novel, like all of his novels. There are lots of ways you can go with it. Todd?
I wish I had a question, but I just want to make a comment that, and I think it maybe sort of chimes a little bit with where you're going, Richard. You mentioned Jeffrey Hinton,
right?
Who I heard a podcast that Jon Stewart, of all people, did with him. And it blew my mind.
Oh, yeah?
It would, if you haven't heard this, go listen to it in part. And I couldn't begin to replicate what Hinton was arguing, but a couple of things sort of chimed with what you were talking about in the interview that I heard. I've been, in what little reading I've been doing about AI, you know, there's a kind of discourse of like, it's not thinking, it's not human, don't. And part of Hinton's point is like, if it's not doing what we call thought, then I don't know what to call it.
Exactly, right, yeah.
So he was basically saying that like our sense of the cogito is completely wrong.
Right.
Like that's a false way of thinking about how our mind actually works. The one other thing that I think might be useful for you that really struck me towards the end of what you were talking about was when you were describing Clara's sort of like coming into visual perception. He talks about how early machine learning taught machines how to discern certain kinds of objects. It really kind of resonated with like so I really now want to read Clara.
Yeah. I think you would love, if nothing else, that representation. I didn't, like recently I haven't been able to Google and find this, but when the novel first came out, I could look at how these boxes really work for AI. And so Ishiguro isn't like his own idea. That's, I mean, like something he just dreamed up. It is really based on the technology and how it how it sees, like its visual component. But yeah, Hinton is fascinating, and the interviews I've heard with him always do blow my mind or really make me think in new directions. And he always acknowledges this is like up for debate within the field. It's, you know, it's one way to think about it, and some people push back very strongly, of course.
Pretty scary.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if he's pretty scary. Maybe he's pretty scary, or maybe what he's talking about is pretty scary. Yeah, right. But so yeah, he's the one who renamed hallucination as confabulation for me, which, you know, was fabulous and kind of fabula. You know, it's like I really tapped into my sense of all sorts of things that interest me, as I said in the paper, particularly the way we remember, and the way we remember so sincerely when we're completely wrong. And yeah, I think that, Grace?
My question's exactly about that, because I read the novel a while ago, so I want you to tell me if I'm confabulating.
Okay.
What happens at the beginning, because it's interesting as an example of you're talking about how attention being drawn to the ways Clara does things or organizes her thoughts and the ways that we do those sorts of things. Am I remembering right that at the beginning she's being moved out of the way because there's some higher level of artificial intelligence robot, you know, that they're promoting, and that Josie just kind of finds her in the store and wants her for whatever reason, so that what's happening to Josie or to people in general with this option for lifting is the same thing that's happening to the robots, the artificial intelligence, and that's happening to her as that they're being lifted to like a next stage.
Right. No, you're absolutely remembering that correctly. The B3s, I think they're called the later model. And one thing that Ishiguro is always, like, as a British writer, very clear about is social class. And I think some of the improvement or the creating an enhanced hierarchy, that's almost always a bad thing, right? And so Clara is able to overcome that to a degree, but she ultimately becomes obsolete, not so much because of her technology, but because they don't need her anymore. And so I do think that theme on both the level of tech and the level of the human is really important. Like, when does a human being become obsolete in the same sort of way? And part of it might be aging, an older person who's like put away in a closet. Part of it might be dismissal of people in divorce. The adult characters are divorced or broken up and have broken hearts and everything else. And I think there's a kind of exploring of what is tossed out, like what becomes obsolete, but also what improvement and the constant mindset of needing the best new thing, particularly with Josie and Rick. Rick is a marvelous character. He has a great deal of emotional intelligence, and he's certainly smart enough, right? So the gene enhancement is like impossible to see, really, I think, with Josie. I just don't think she's superior. She's just told she's superior, and she has an edge, and she can go to universities, and he can't, and, you know, all these distinctions.
Failure of the author to make her as smart as she's supposed to make her come across as being lifted.
Not at all. No, I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that Ishiguro makes a lot of the ethical issues complicated, and we have to wrestle with them. But when it comes to hierarchies, I think he just deflates them and just shows how insidious and harmful they are. So no, I think it becomes the biggest illusion with all of this angst about giving more opportunities and everything through this genetic enhancement. No, I think he makes Rick a very admirable character. He's also, of course, emphasizing the importance of emotional intelligence over enhanced academic abilities and so forth. Deanie, did you have your hand up?
No, I mean, I was going to comment, but he already left. So I was wondering with the consciousness, I think the one thing that distinguishes her from the others is her she's hardwired to be the friend, Josie. And that, I think, does, although she has some willful, because she has some agency in terms of how to save and what's best for Josie, but it's still, I think, there's an element that's kind of, I don't want to call it not human, but the way in which she self-sacrifices, I mean, herself is wrapped up in being friends to Josie. I think that's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
She learns like humans do, and she
Right.
perceives things in some similar ways.
I think what's really interesting, the way you describe it, Deanie, is that she's programmed. She's not like a human in her absolute other-directed devotion to Josie and devotion to alleviating loneliness, and that seems to suggest a lack of agency. But there are these moments when she says, like, well, what would happen to this, about herself? And there's the moment when she's finally done and she can gather her memories and vividly relive things. Those seem like moments of agency. But of course, the biggest moment of agency are those treks to the barn and the finding the Cootings machine and doing these things to save the girl she cares about. So even though he doesn't use the word agency and doesn't directly engage in the debate, I think that if you just look at her as a character in the novel, it's very hard to deny her humanity. You can do that, though. I think you can approach the novel that way, and that feels like a really strong misreading to me personally. It feels like you're kind of denying literature. It's like you're imposing a kind of philosophical, scientific view on it and not letting it shake you out of that. Because I think the novel kind of wants to shake you out of that.
Yeah. Does she have a heart? Does she have many rooms?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Right. Well, the way I'm approaching it with her, constructing her identity through her storytelling, I would say yes. I mean, she has a lot of complexity, and she tells us things in one way, but that is her way, and that alone, right? Some people, like Isabel, you love her, right? Some people love Clara. And if you fall in love with a character, she's got to have a heart herself. She's got to have that complexity. And no, you don't think so?
I remember when we read this book in the Quest for Self class, and, that discussion came up of, whether we view Clara as a human. And I said, I was in the yes camp. I think reading the story through her point of view, really aids to that. But, also, she does have agency, in my opinion, just with the example you gave of how she goes out of her way to want to save Josie. But yeah, ultimately I was telling you how I cried at the end, just because it was, she dedicated her life to, Josie, and then she was relegated first to, this closet, a spare bedroom, and then once Josie went off to college, she goes to retire, as it were, to the junkyard, and that just was because I did view her as human, even though technically she's a AF. I could go on and on, but yes, I see her as human.
I think there are many, many issues in this novel that my paper doesn't even touch on. But this question in our own society of artificial friendship is very real. There are definitely people who are now using AI for therapy, for friendship, for things that a human therapist won't provide, for things that a spouse wouldn't provide. And what can be a little scary about that is the many rooms, the complexity, the friction between people, the way that we don't understand each other. That all seems kind of bad, right? But it's really not. I think it's really good. I think it's really where we have genuine conversation and we come from difference and find ways to navigate difference. Whereas I think AI smooths it all over and tells you good things and supports you and reinforces you and feeds your addictions, right? All those things. So, and I don't think this came up in my paper, though, as I said, I have notes on another talk that's more about technology. But Josie at various points will not accept Clara. Clara says, I can play the bubble game when she has a quarrel with Rick, and Josie is appalled. You cannot play the bubble game with me. Why would you even suggest that? And then later she has a nightmare about her own death. she's confronting things as she wakes up, and she needs her mother, only her mother. And Clara says, this is what I'm here for. I'm your artificial friend. I'm supposed to comfort you in the middle of the night. And she rejects it. So I don't know. I don't know if we're at that point of, I don't know if we've gone beyond that into like, just give me my AF therapy. I don't know. Right. Any other questions? Other things for those of you who've read the novel? Some things that you thought about when you thought about AI or?
We read it a while ago, and I did not know we would be this far
Yeah.
fast. So I'm just so
Yeah.
horrified that
Mhm.
where we're at.
Yeah, this far, this fast is how I feel too. And there is in the novel, Paul is replaced. So the whole, future of replacing our jobs. What Ishiguro does with that is he makes him sort of Trumpy, and even uses, this is like written, like in the midst of the first, there's a character named Melania. And then Paul says some of the things that Trump says, but he's fine with being replaced and being out of work. But then he forms this society where they're like proto-fascists, and they are just like conspiracy theorists. They spend all their leisure time now like dreaming up these conspiracies. And he's not visiting his daughter. I mean, she's like so happy to see him, but that he's kind of given up on. I mean, he obviously loves her, but you know what I mean? I think the novel subtly explores what happens with this replacement, not just that you don't have work, but then what do you have, right? I don't know. But yes, it's happening very fast. Other hand? Were there, John, I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, I want to ask you if it's a novel, which I have not read, it's very aware of its place in literary history with sort of a veneer of, today's technology over it. And the reason I'm asking that, I have many reasons, but you mentioned portrait many times.
Mm-hmm.
Well, of course, portrait related comes immediately to mind. And Isabel Archer has revelations, and there are sort of different Isabel Archers in the novel that progresses, and Portrait of Dorian Gray.
For sure.
Andrea Quartet is all based on different memories. In Poe, there are lots of twins and doppelgangers, and there's one woman who replaces another woman inside her body. So I kept hearing things that made me think, I know this and I read this before, and it's from 19th century literature. Even the way you described what she sees made me think of Picasso or Matisse or something like that. And so,
right.
You're more adept in the history of the novel than I am by far. So is
my answer is
novel that,
definitely yes. Yeah, it's
has its place.
It does, yes, definitely. All of his novels do. And the metafictional turn that happens at some point in almost every novel, usually fairly subtly, sometimes with a certain self-mockery, but it always opens up. Talk about the room within a room within a room. It always opens up literary history and traditions and other forms of representation and other characters and the way other writers, for me anyway. And I think I do really appreciate contemporary writers like that who are really moving out of the tradition and kind of channeling some of these earlier writers. Zadie Smith is another great example, I think, of a writer who does that. So yeah, my own reading of Ishiguro is that. And I think that's sort of what Margaret Atwood was tapping into when she says, the novels pretend to do these genre things or pretend to work with an issue of technology. And it's not that they don't do that. That's there in the novel too. But there's so much else under the surface of that if people stop there, I think they're really limiting what the novel wants you to think about, which is almost always something really big and existential that leaves you in tears at the end. Right? I mean, you're not just there pondering things. Usually you're sobbing about the prospect of your own death or something. Yeah. So that's why I think he moves to this other place that is very much a literary place, all these, broad human concerns.
And it can make you rethink the ethical issues brought up in prior works too.
Exactly. Yeah. There's conversations, within the novel ethically, but then also among different novels that it evokes. Yeah. Good point. And Ishiguro is definitely not the only writer to do that. I think that's something we really feel, that intertextuality in the conversation with other literature. Yeah, good point. Any other questions or things you wanted to talk about? Or Sandy?
When you were talking first about confabulation, for some reason it had me thinking about discourse on social media, right? Where so much of it seems, there's like a kind of certainty that goes along with some of these conspiracy theories and other kinds of things that people, I know I read it somewhere, and then they immediately kind of impart it with, credibility, and yet it seems to be maybe just confabulations. I don't know, but you have me thinking about the honest lie.
Right, right.
And, whether that's another lens through which we might think about things like misinformation and disinformation online.
I think that's a really great point. And that's what I kind of wanted at the beginning, even though like my interest is in the memory kind of confabulation, but that other meaning of confab, like that fast and loose conversation where you're telling each other things, and social media can do that so much that there's this great sincerity. Someone fully believes in a complete and utter falsehood, that they've just convinced themselves and they've convinced others. It's very, very similar to what we do when we try to remember something, and we just feel like so certain it went this way until someone tells us, here are the facts, or here's a journal entry that I had from that day, or whatever it is that gives more grounding. So, yeah. And the bubble game with the texting, I thought was really clever in the novel as a way of, they're doing old-fashioned drawing and writing, art, but the overlay is the techie texting back and forth, bubble, right? So I don't know.
Bring it even though they're next to each other in the same.
Exactly, right. Yeah, just the way kids or even adults might do, right? With that particular
graphic novels, which
true.
Sometimes adaptations, right?
Yeah, I thought about that too.
Work and someone's done an adaptation,
right?
Historical incident, and
right.
You've got the bubbles and everything.
Right, because it really also does echo graphic novels and young people's real I don't know what's going on in the other rooms. Something very physical. So yeah, I think that Ishiguro does kind of become controversial when he borrows from genres or taps into something in contemporary culture, because he does it in his own way. But I think it almost always is very creative, and it's a way of reigniting what he started in his first novel and what he's done in different novels. But it has a similar core, but he brings something new to it by focusing on clones, or focusing on AI, or focusing on ancient Britain and dragons and Britons, as in Very Giant, or the detective novel. He does a bit of a parody of that in When We Were Orphans. And The Unconsoled, it just kind of goes crazy with a big experimental novel that has a lot of humor and a lot of rule breaking and strangeness. But at the core, again, it's dealing with some of these same questions of memory and a sense of self through memory, and certain kinds of anxieties, and relationship tensions, especially between parents and children. So yeah. I guess I say all that and maybe this is true of a lot of writers, but it's very true of Ishiguro. You feel like you're reading one big novel when you read his novels. It's like, here's a new chapter to the same novel, but it's like recast or something. I don't know if other people feel that reading him. It makes it, I don't know, it makes it sort of more fun to think of it as a whole. He's got I guess 8 novels now. But yeah.
Which is your favorite?
My favorite is Never Let Me Go. Yeah. Yeah, I think this. But I also really do love Clara and the Sun, and I think they're great together. I think they comment on each other in interesting ways.
So what's next for this paper? Are you in the midst of, publishing? Or?
Yeah, as I said, it's a work in progress. I want to rethink parts of it, and read more. There's like he's attracted lots of scholars, especially after winning the Nobel Prize in 2017. So yeah, I'm going to continue to work on it, and on a bigger scale, think about a book on his novels altogether. So anyway, thanks again, everyone, for coming out during the busy time, and yeah, happy Ishiguro reading one way or the other.